Have found your cozy place. Thank you, Clara Robbins, for this beautiful piano melody at the beginning. And now it's time for me to welcome you for the final session of the Gaza Tribunal here in Istanbul. For the next 3 to 4 days, we will be hearing, witnessing, we will be discussing and analyzing everything that has been going on in Gaza for the past 2 years mostly, and for the past period in general. During this conference, in 4 days, we will reach the final verdict for the war crimes and genocide happening in Gaza by Israel at the moment. And at this point, after saying welcome again, I will call Richard Falk, President of the Gaza Tribunal, to address you and wish you a good morning.
Good morning and welcome. It is a special honor for me to welcome all of you, and especially our distinguished jury of conscience, to this final session of the Gaza People's Tribunal. We are also grateful to those who have traveled long distances to participate as witnesses and experts. I also want to pay tribute to all of the dedicated members of the steering committee and our 3 chambers that have worked tirelessly these past months to make the Gaza Tribunal become a reality. We are grateful to the sponsors who initially came to invite Hilal Elver and myself to take on this responsibility of organizing the tribunal, a task we have been devoted to for more than a year. Without the support of Taha Ayhan and his associates, as well as the Islamic Cooperative Youth Forum, we would not have had the resources to make this tribunal a reality. We thank him and his associates also for upholding the pledge of political independence from any interference by politicians in this endeavor and in our efforts. Finally, we thank the University of Istanbul for providing us with the hosting auspices. We convene at a critical moment of paused genocidal assault on the Palestinian civilian population of occupied Gaza, with lethal spillover effects in the West Bank. Although thankful for this pause in bombardment and drone missiles and surveillance and disastrous effects consisting of prior periodic cutoffs in the delivery of humanitarian aid, it is far from enough. We should be on our guard against supposing that the genocide is over or that a just peace is on its way. This is the time for vigilance not a time to suppose that the urgent challenge posed by the Gaza genocide has become a matter of history. We must remind ourselves that the surviving Gazan population continues to be struggling day by day with homelessness, hunger, disease, injuries, the pain of lost and mutilated loved ones, induced chaos, and a variety of Israeli violent provocations. Gazans continue to be confronted with the instabilities of an ultra-dangerous wasteland, undoubtedly haunted by fears that the high-intensity genocide of preceding months could resume at any moment. The global media, the Arab and Muslim majority countries, have shifted their focus from genocide to the Trump diplomacy, creating this widespread illusion that peacefulness is taking over. The Trump initiative has yielded a fragile ceasefire, to be sure, properly welcomed by most of the world, and especially by the desperate survivors of the past 2 years in Gaza. The Trump diplomacy claims to go further, boasting of having found a solution for the underlying conflict by way of a 20-point plan crafted with the approval of Israel's government, a plan that harkens back to colonial times. It is even overseen by a so-called Board of Peace headed by Donald Trump, to be administered under the direction of Tony Blair. There are no provisions for accountability in relation to the crimes that have been committed. Quite the contrary. Both the perpetrator of genocide and the chief enabler have suddenly assumed the mantle of peacemaker before the stunned eyes and ears of the world. We should be aware that Israel has not even renounced the genocidal goals of establishing Greater Israel by absorbing the Palestinian territories within its sovereign territorial space. It is against this Janus-faced background that the final session of the GPT meets. Janus is the Roman god who faced in two directions. One face looked at what has gone before, the other face looks at what is to come. It is the god of transitions and also of false hopes. So it is with the Gaza Tribunal. In the coming days, the jury will listen to survivor testimony from persons who have lived through this terrible ordeal in Gaza that started days after the Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023. It will also hear expert witnesses addressing the main components of genocide as the devastation of more than 83% of Gaza homes, the destruction of water, electricity, and sanitation infrastructure, the deliberate targeting of hospitals, places of worship, heritage sites, schools and universities, as well as assassinations carried out against journalists, doctors, health and aid delivery personnel, and truth tellers, as well as UNRWA staff members. We wish to make clear that the Gaza Tribunal is not trying to compete with or mimic conventional courts by adjudicating between antagonistic parties from a starting point of neutrality. It is openly partisan and does not proceed from the adage, innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. At the same time, we take note of the judicial professionalism of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court that provides a firm grounding in international law for the work of the Gaza Tribunal and its pronouncements. The Gaza Tribunal came into being as an act of conscience on the part of unaffiliated persons in civil society around the world and guided by a multinational steering committee and an advisory policy council. From the start, it has benefited immensely from the robust and persuasive participation of its Palestinian members with respect to all tribunal activities. The Gaza Tribunal should be considered as one of several instruments for providing people with a truthful account of the horrifying events unfolding in Gaza over the past 2 years, and acting as a call to action on behalf of a justice-oriented, durable peace achieved through Palestinian participation throughout, which has not been allowed to occur at this point to any extent. Such an undertaking partakes of the same motivations that inform the struggle of fearless journalists to file commentaries on the images of daily atrocities happening in Gaza. In this sense, the GPT is a form of societal resistance to state propaganda and media bias, which selectively filter news imports so as to convey a pro-Israeli slant. A recent attempt is the incredible attention to the relative and joyful reception of 20 living Israeli hostages taken captive during the Hamas-led attack. This attention, confronted with treating the comparable release of 1,900 Palestinians, mostly arbitrarily imprisoned and badly abused, without being worthy of the slightest notice. The contrast, the double standards in reporting this hostage prisoner release reinforces the central aim of the Israel propaganda machine to present itself as victim rather than as perpetrator. The Gaza Tribunal also gives credit to the UN efforts to circumvent the geopolitics that paralyze preventive enforcement actions that could have challenged the genocide at its initial stage. As long as the geopolitical muscle of the Western liberal democracies stood shoulder to shoulder with Israel's military campaign, the UN was politically paralyzed. What the UN did do, and deserves credit for doing, is to join the symbolic politics of the legitimacy war that is won or lost by the side that gains control of the legal and moral public discourse. The UN did this by the special procedures of the Human Rights Council that established a Gaza Commission of Inquiry composed of international law and human rights experts that released a month ago an 82-page report that documented in detail the Gaza genocide. Even more dramatic were the 3 superbly researched reports on the genocide submitted by Francesca Albanese, the unpaid UN Special Rapporteur. Despite facing taunting harassments and hurtful defamation, Ms. Albanese bravely was threatened. Yes, I can. Was bravely threatened in her heroic efforts to carry the truth to a wider public to counter the official lies and propaganda. For her efforts, she was subjected to unprecedented sanctions by the U.S. government, barring entry to the U.S. to deliver her report to the General Assembly and having her American assets frozen, all in violation of the U.S. obligation to uphold the host country treaty. In another brazen move, the U.S. denied visas to representatives of the PLO while welcoming the Israeli Prime Minister. Unsurprisingly, the President of Colombia called for the movement of the UN from the U.S., which prompted Washington to take punitive action in the form of the cutoff of all economic aid to Colombia. As the proponents of the genocide in Gaza use their hard and soft power to seek to make people swallow lies, the Gaza Tribunal, UN Special Rapporteurs, and indeed journalists and witnesses struggle with words, resistance, and solidarity to make truth triumph. The gradual consensus that Israel has become a pariah or rogue state is solid evidence that Palestinians are winning or have won the legitimacy war. The record of colonial wars since 1945 is that the winner of the legitimacy war eventually controls the political outcome, although often at the cost of great human suffering. The U.S. should have learned this lesson in Vietnam, where it dominated all phases of the military combat and yet lost the war. It is against this background that we have invited distinguished moral and legal authority figures to be members of our jury of conscience. The jury will hear in the coming days from witnesses and experts that will provide substantive support for allegations of genocide and crimes against humanity. At the end of the process, the jury will deliver its verdict on the salient questions emergent from the testimonies that they have heard, and later deliver a consensus document that sets forth their reasoning in more detail. This will be included in the book that is planned to be published as soon as possible that summarizes the work of the Gaza Tribunal. It is our hope that each juror will also be moved to write a reflective essay for the book that gives their personalized account of their experience in confronting genocide in this manner. The Gaza Tribunal aims at more than a confirmation of the genocide and making a contribution to the legitimacy war. Present conditions in Gaza and the West Bank require more than words or symbolic politics. It requires action and commitment. Israel is continuing behind the screen of this deceptive diplomacy of supposed peacemaking to pursue the Zionist endgame of Palestinian erasure and creative and greater Israel. The Knesset is on the apparent verge of passing a bill calling upon the government to annex the West Bank. And its repeated violations of the ceasefire in recent days have given evidence that it's not pursuing the path of peace, but rather seems to be seeking the provocation of Hamas to provide a pretext for renewing the full fury of its genocidal assault. In conclusion, we hope the jury of conscience will share our sense of urgency to expose the realities not only of what has happened, but what is happening. Now is the time for solidarity, initiatives with the Palestinian struggle for basic rights. Now is the time to insist on Israeli accountability for the commission of the crime of crimes. Now is the time to expose the moral hypocrisy of the complicit supporter of prolonged and transparent genocide carried out against an essentially helpless and innocent population. We pledge our support for the jury of conscience and to carry on with the work of this tribunal, and thank all of you who have helped us carry the process this far. The struggle goes on. Justice will prevail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Folk. As they say, when voices fade, conscience is made. Now, I will introduce you, jury of conscience, and each one of you, as I mention your name, I will ask you kindly to just step on the stage and sit into your chair. So, Christine Chenkin is the first member of the jury. She's a professor of FBA, SMG, is Emerita Professor of International Law at the London School of Economy and Global Law Professor at the University of Michigan. She's author or co-author of several books on international law, including The Boundaries of International Law and Feminist Analysis in 20. Keniz Murad was born in Paris to a Turkish mother and an Indian father. Before studying psychology and psychology at the Sorbonne, she met a real family and discovered her Muslim roots at the age of 18. From 1969 to 1982, she reported for the French weekly news magazine Le Nouvel Observateur, specializing in the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, covering, among the other major world events, the Lebanese Civil War, the Ethiopian Revolution, Revolution, and the Palestine-Israeli conflict. In 1980, Princess, which was largely based on the life of her mother, an exiled Ottoman princess. This enjoyed huge success both in Keniz's native France, but also around the world, being translated into 30. Which again focuses on India and the different and testimonies of ordinary people in a war-torn society, published in English by publications, is the translation of this major work. But since then, all her books have been boycotted by the French media, very much under Zionist influence. Even if her two books, In the City of Gold and Silver, the real story of an Indian Muslim queen who led the first revolution against the British, and In the Land of the Pure, geopolitical novel taking place in Pakistan, have nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Nowadays, Keniz Murad is living in Istanbul. She precedes since 20 years the France-Turkey Literary Prize, and her awards are Officer of Arts and Letters, Knight of the Legion of Honor. We also have Chandra Muzaffar. Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the president of the International Movement for a Just World, an international NGO based in Malaysia, which seeks to critic global injustice and to develop an alternative vision of a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. The author and editor of 42 books in English and Malay, many of his writings have been translated into other languages. Among Chandra's latest publications are A Changing World, Emerging Realities, it's an ebook, and Palestine Reflecting on One of the Noblest Struggles for Justice, ebook 2. Today, apart from his role in JUST, Chandra sits on the board of a number of international NGOs concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. Chandra was a professor and the director of the Center for Civilizational Dialogue, University of Malaya from 1997 to 1999, and a professor of global studies at University Sens Malaysia 2007 to 2012. Chandra is the recipient of a number of international awards related to his scholarship and social activism. Chandra is married to Mariam Mokhtarsim, and they have 2 daughters. And we have Gaza Karmi. Dr. Gaza Karmi is a Palestinian physician, academic, and author whose life and work have been profoundly shaped by the experience of exile and the Palestinian struggle for justice. Gaza Karmi was born in Jerusalem and was forced to leave her home with her family as a result of Israelis' creation in 1948. The family moved to England in 1949, and she pursued higher education and earned a medical degree from the University of Bristol. She later specialized in public health, particularly on migrant health and support for undeserved communities. Karmi began to engage more directly with Palestinian political activism. She co-founded the first British-Palestinian medical charity that aimed to address the healthcare needs of Palestinians living under occupation and in refugee camps. Dr. Karmi has become one of the most prominent voices articulating the Palestinian narrative in both scholarly and public forums. She has taught at SOAS at the University of Exeter and has written extensively on Middle Eastern politics, identity, and displacement. Her acclaimed books include In Search of Fatima, A Palestinian Story, Married to Another Man, Israeli's Dilemma in Palestine, and Return, A Palestinian Memoir. Beyond her books, Karmi has contributed articles and commentary to numerous international outlets. She has also appeared in documentaries and public debates, consistently advocating for Palestinian rights and challenging dominant media narratives that marginalize Palestinian perspectives. Dr. Karmi continues to speak and write internationally, combining her medical, scholarly, and activist perspectives to advocate for justice, equality, and the right of return for Palestinians. Sami Al-Arian is a professor and the founding director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul University. He lived in the United States for 4 decades, where he was a tenured academic. Dr. Al-Arian founded numerous institutions and publications in the fields of education, research, religion, interfaith work, advocacy, civil and human rights, and Palestine, foreign policy, and international relations. In 2001, Newsweek named him a premier civil rights activist in the US for his efforts to repeal the use of secret evidence in immigration courts. In 2012, historians profiled him in the Encyclopedia of American Dissidents as one of only 3 Muslims in the United States among 152 dissidents and prisoners of conscience included over the past century, alongside the legend of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali. Dr. Al-Arian was a prolific speaker across many US campuses, and since relocating to Turkey, at venues worldwide, Dr. Al-Arian is also the author of dozens of studies, articles, and books on topics related to Islam and the West, to the Islamic Ummah, Islamophobia, civil rights, Palestine, the Arab Spring, the Middle East, and the American foreign policy. Since the Israeli genocide in Gaza in 2023, Dr. Al-Arian has been widely featured in programs around the world in multiple languages and has advocated for the dismantling of Zionist structures worldwide based on his theory of the 12 pillars of Israeli imperatives. And Biljana Vankovska. Biljana Vankovska is a retired professor of political science, peace studies, and international relations from Skopje. It's in North Macedonia. She serves as a board member of the Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research in Lund, Sweden, and is a member of the No Cold War International Collective. Throughout her career, Professor Vankovska has held several distinguished academic and research positions, including guest senior research fellow at the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute, faculty member of the European Peace University in Stadtschlaning in Austria, and senior fellow at the Geneva Center for the Democratic Control of Armed Forces. She was also actively involved in the RECOM Initiative for Truth and Reconciliation in the territory of the former Yugoslavia. And for the first panel, overviewing the work of the Gaza Tribunal Chambers, you will be hosted and moderated by our dear professor, Penny Green. So Penny Green, hello and welcome.
I'll start again. My name is Penny Green. I'm Professor of Law and Globalization and Director of the International State Crime Initiative at Queen Mary, University of London. I'm on the steering committee of the Gaza People's Tribunal, and I'll be moderating today's session. I just want to remind, though Richard did mention this in his talk towards the end, that this is a people's tribunal. It is not a judicial court. And I think it's very important for us to understand that we exist in the tradition of the Russell Tribunal and the Permanent People's Tribunal that was based in Rome. So the jury will listen to all of the expert and witness testimony that will be delivered today and over the course of the next 3 days. And they will then ask questions of those who are delivering testimony, if they require to do so. And then at the end of the 3 days, they will deliberate and basically prepare a concluding statement on all that they have heard. Before we begin the next session, I just want to remind speakers that we are sticking to a very tight 10-minute delivery time. We're already running a little late. It's not too bad, but and there are moments where we can catch up. So I think now we will move to the chambers.
Yeah, thank you. Just before we start, my apologies for interrupting. If anyone from the audience needs a simultaneous translation, you can find it at the entrance. Our team made sure that you all hear everything today and understand. Thank you.
Okay. I'll ask you to try to face this way. Thanks. Okay, so as Richard mentioned, the tribunal, the initial segment of our People's Tribunal was organised around 3 chambers, basically one relating to international law, another to international relations and world order, and the third, history, ethics, criminology and philosophy. So I'm going to start off and welcome to discuss a tight summary of all of the work that Chamber 1 on international law did, and I'd like to welcome to the stage Susan Akram. Thank you, Susan. And could I ask speakers, because in order for the jury to hear adequately, to slightly face towards the jurors, if that's possible.
Good morning, and welcome all of us to Istanbul. It's always a pleasure to be here in this wonderful historic city. My task is simply to introduce the objectives and the work of the International Law Chamber of the Gaza Tribunal. In the face of a complete failure of international law to prevent or halt a genocide, we as civil society have only the power of our voices and the ability to name the criminals, create a record of the crimes, and provide the evidence for accountability in the future. These were the objectives of Chamber 1, the International Law Chamber of the Gaza People's Tribunal, some of whom you will hear from today, while the testimonies of others were presented at the Sarajevo session and at another tribunal-related session in Alicante, Spain, earlier this year. Our task has been to assemble and assess the available evidence on the crimes and violations of human rights that Israel has been committing, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes of aggression and genocide. The Chamber 1 experts have produced legal analyses on each of these crimes under the relevant treaties and humanitarian law, which will be compiled in the final Gaza Tribunal written proceedings. It's important to note that our aim was not, as Richard Falk mentioned, to duplicate what has already been analyzed in the cases pending or decided by the International Criminal Court or the International Court of Justice, but to supplement and fill the gaps in those proceedings. It has also been our aim to identify the weaknesses in the existing legal tribunals and the frameworks within which they operate. For example, we attempted to frame issues that are not adequately covered in existing law, such as ecocide, scholasticide, ethnic cleansing, the use of technology to target and massively kill civilians, and identify weaknesses in occupation law and the right of occupied people to resist. In support of the legal frameworks, we marshaled survivor, witness, and expert testimony from Palestinian, regional, and international civil society organizations and others who could provide credible evidence about these crimes. This evidence was presented at the public sessions in Sarajevo, and more will be presented over the next few days. In a full day of testimonies in Sarajevo, experts and eyewitnesses called by Chamber 1 addressed the root causes of the genocide, covering the Nakba and the colonial project in Palestine. Our experts addressed the elements of genocide, connecting it to apartheid and the denial of Palestinian self-determination. Building on the root causes and the legal frameworks of the foundational crimes, our experts provided testimony on distinct patterns of genocide. For example, the crimes and wrongs of torture, the holding of political prisoners incommunicado, and arbitrary detention of thousands of Palestinians without charge or trial, held hostage by Israel, but not characterized by the media or public as such. The related crimes of famine and deprivation of the right to food were also detailed by witnesses, including the complete destruction of agriculture, access to water, and the prevention of vital humanitarian aid from entering in the ongoing crippling siege of Gaza. Finally, Chamber 1 experts have analyzed particular types of war crimes that have reached a level of intensity and scope in Gaza not seen in recent conflicts around the world. The massive disproportionate targeting of civilians, the almost complete and deliberate destruction of the Gaza healthcare system, and the targeting of reproductive systems. In Sarajevo, Dr. Mimi Sayed and Dr. Thaer Ahmed, who have both served in Gaza, provided detailed evidence of the purposeful shooting of children in the head. The disproportionate numbers of children targeted for death by the Israeli military. According to Dr. Sayed, over 80% of the children she treated in Gaza were under the age of 10. They testified about the effects of lack of medication, lack of clean water, lack of electricity, lack of anesthesia on women and children in particular, all magnified by the deliberately enforced famine. The doctors discussed their struggles to save lives in surgery, even conducting operations without anesthesia, to learn that their patients had died of famine or were targeted again for death after leaving the hospital. Testimonials from Gaza and Gazans outside the territory highlighted just a fraction of the plethora of evidence available to support the elements of crimes of apartheid, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Of course, our overall challenge is to the international legal system itself that has utterly failed in its most critical task, preventing and halting the worst of international crimes, that of genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and for keeping so well to time. Can I now call on Chamber 2, Craig McIver, who will be delivering online. And Craig will summarise the work of the Chamber 2, which dealt with international relations and world order. Welcome, Craig.
Thank you, Penny. Distinguished members of the jury, Chamber 2 is responsible for examining international relations and world order, including the response of international institutions and the broader international order to the genocide in Gaza. Chamber 2 is comprised of recognized experts in international relations, international law, and in Palestine, the names of whom you will find in your materials. Distinguished jury, the findings of Chamber 2 are a story of contrasts, the contrast between the human rights promise of the post-war international order on the one hand, and the absolute abject failure of the international system to deliver on that promise on the other hand. The contrast between the courageous and principled action of some in the international system, such as the independent human rights rapporteurs of the UN, the humanitarians of UNRWA on the one hand, and the inaction, abdication, and at times direct complicity of the political corridors of the organization on the other. And the contrast between the rhetoric about human rights and the rule of law of Western states like the US, UK, and Germany on the one hand, and their outright complicity in the denial of the human rights of the Palestinian people on the other. In sum, despite a mandate to act, ample warning, mountains of evidence, and the live streaming of the Israeli regime's crimes, the open declaration of the regime's genocidal intentions, and a global demand for action, the international system has failed to stop genocide in Palestine, and it is now poised to deny both accountability and redress. Many, with the obligation and capacity to act, have simply chosen to allow the genocide to continue. Worse, the actions of some have actually contributed to the reinforcing of Israeli impunity, the very impunity that is the key root cause of the regime's serial criminality. As a result, those actors in the international sphere, the institutions they represent, and the broader international system in which they are situated, have suffered a serious, perhaps fatal blow to the legitimacy and ultimately to their sustainability. The work of our chamber reveals that these failures have been absolute in the genocide in Palestine and in the century of Nakba endured by the Palestinian people. It shows that the Gaza genocide is only the latest and most extreme phase of the ongoing Nakba, which Lara Alborno described as, quote, a century-long violent settler colonial process aimed at eliminating the indigenous Palestinian population to consolidate Jewish Israeli settler sovereignty over an ever-expanding territory. Here too, the failures and complicities of the international system are evident, beginning with the original sin of partitioning the land against the will of the indigenous people in 1947, and continuing with the reinforcing of the Israel exception to international law until today. Sami Al-Aryan explains in Chamber 2 that dismantling structures of domination like Zionism is the only path to genuine peace and the only remedy proportionate to the catastrophe that began with the Nakba and continues through the Gaza genocide. Quote, a system built to dispossess cannot be reformed into justice, end quote. The work of Halal Alvar in our chamber reveals how Gaza exemplifies how political power shields perpetrators from accountability in the international system. By way of proof, she points to the overwhelming scientific evidence of famine that was suppressed for months, how action was obstructed by Israel and the United States, and other Western states attacked UNRWA, allowed the GHF aid ruse to act as a tool of oppression and control, and intentionally avoided the use of the words famine and genocide, even trying to silence UN experts. And Professor Penny Green in Chamber 2 writes of a, quote, pandemic of disabilities in Gaza, with thousands of Gazans subjected by the Israeli forces to the horror of limb amputation, spinal cord injury, life-changing burns, and acquired brain injury, together with the intentional and systematic destruction of the healthcare system, meaning that for many, she says, permanent disability is assured. Day after day for 2 years, the international system has allowed this to continue. Gianni Tognoni, for his work in the chamber, notes that while the evidence of genocide has been long widely recognized by experts and international bodies and by the people of the world, what has been lacking has been accountability for the regime's crimes and redress for the Palestinian people. And members of the jury, Richard Falk and Paulina Chan, in their contributions to Chamber 2, point to a contradiction at the very core of the United Nations. While the UN Charter sets out a promise of a new approach to global peace and security based on international law, the structures that it creates, in their words, were, quote, designed to give the winners of World War II geopolitical control over global security through permanent membership on the Security Council and the right of the veto. That veto would be used 6 times by the US as a co-perpetrator in the genocide in Palestine to prevent a ceasefire and action to stop the bloodshed. Nor are any of these challenges particularly new. My own work in the tribunal has revealed how the Israeli exception to international law and the complicity of the international system in creating and sustaining that exception dates back to the earliest days of the post-war order, of the UN, and of the Israeli state itself. Allowed to grow and fester for 8 decades, the virus of exception has now thoroughly infected the political corridors of international institutions like the UN. The genocide of the past 2 years in Palestine and the inaction and even complicity of some international institutions has revealed the depth and breadth of that infection. But I would ask the jury to note that there are in fact 2 UNs, one committed to the norms and standards of the Charter and of the human rights instruments, and another more empowered in the international order that operates in obsequious deference to state power. As a result, and despite historic developments in the ICJ, skilled and principled work by the special procedures, and heroic work by UNRWA and other humanitarian actors in the UN system, the response of the overall international system to the genocide in Palestine has been wholly inadequate. The Security Council has been paralyzed by the U.S. veto, and the General Assembly, despite some important action, has continued to allow Israel's full participation and has failed to mobilize protection for Palestinians or any accountability for Israel, although it is empowered to do so, including under the Uniting for Peace mechanism. And that the UN Secretary General and senior secretariat leaders, including those responsible for human rights and for genocide prevention, have failed to even call out the genocide, taking refuge instead in the safe language of conflict or both sides or humanitarian aid and the amorphous promise of a two-state solution someday. Members of the jury, Ramzi Baroud of Chamber 2 shows the long historical continuum of colonial domination that has been met with Palestinian sumud, or steadfast perseverance, quote, rendering Palestinian resistance an enduring moral and political assertion of existence, sovereignty, and dignity in the face of relentless colonial erasure and external domination. And beyond the resistance and steadfastness of the Palestinian people, Chamber 2 has also examined the role of global solidarity in advancing accountability where official institutions have failed to do so. Phyllis Bennis, in her work for Chamber 2, points to the model of the 1980s global anti-apartheid campaigns against South Africa, which compelled governments to respect ostensibly non-binding UN resolutions and brought enough pressure to bear that even the US was forced to give in to domestic demands for sanctions. The opportunity to take similar action was highlighted in the work of Haider Eid for Chamber 2, demonstrating the similarities between classic apartheid and the exclusive Zionist nature of Israel and its corresponding system of racial domination, with laws and institutions that, quote, encroach deeply on the lives of the indigenous population. Asmer Safi explored how the university encampments demanded that universities divest from Israel and how they were met with severe repression, stonewalling, suspensions and expulsions, police violence and arrests, in some cases, government-initiated deportations. And Phyllis Bennis has also reported on the massive protests beyond universities that erupted in U.S. cities, bringing together Palestinian and Jewish and Arab and Muslim and Black and other communities, and spreading rapidly across the globe with actions in virtually every major city. In their testimony to the tribunal, Asla Bali, Allah Haj Yahya, and Basuki Nasiya show how international law has been, quote, an enduring reference point for Palestine as well as an enduring source of frustration. Citing the myriad failures of international law and international legal institutions such as the ICC and the ICJ, they argue that alternative initiatives like the Gaza Tribunal have the potential to address these shortcomings by embodying alternative jurisprudential paradigms. To conclude, distinguished members of the jury, Chamber 2 has found that the international legal and political system, constructed 80 years ago on the ruins of brutal colonization, unfettered capitalism, wars of aggression, and serial genocide, has failed in its promise of never again. Sometimes by design, and at others through abdication, key components of that system have taken no effective action to prevent or end the genocide, to provide accountability for the perpetrators or a redress for the victims or survivors, or even to name the crime out loud, genocide. Instead, it has deferred to powerful states, including states complicit in the perpetration of these crimes, effectively abandoning the victims and the vulnerable people of Palestine. The exceptions to this general finding, evident in the courageous and principled work of the UN's independent human rights rapporteurs, commissions of inquiry, the ICJ, or the heroism and sacrifice of UNRWA and other humanitarian workers, do not excuse the abject failures of the political leadership and the intergovernmental bodies of the UN. But the Chamber 2 reveals that there is an international body beyond and above the Security Council. It is the collective of global civil society, the movements, the unions, the human rights defenders, the peace activists, the people. They have been active where official institutions have been absent, in the people's encampments on university campuses, the people's demonstrations in capitals across the world, the people's marches through the Sinai, the people's flotillas sailing the Mediterranean to break the siege, the people's movements like BDS, and the people's tribunals like this one. And it is these movements of people that provide a light in what has otherwise been one of the darkest moments in human history. I hope the jury will hold them up as beacons of morality and justice, even as you hold accountable the international institutions that in trepidatious deference to power have abandoned their mandates, abandoned the Palestinian people, and abandon we the peoples of the United Nations. I thank you.
And finally, we'll have a representation from Chamber 3, Jamil Aydin, who was one of the co-chairs. So thank you, Jamil.
Dear distinguished members of the Jury of Conscience, Chamber 3 is composed of more than 10 scholars, of historians, genocide scholars, philosophers, ethicists, and we focused on the ideological roots of the genocide and try to understand how this happened despite the slogans of never again, and how humanity failed Palestinians, and how the perpetrators weaponized myths and lies about history, how they distorted ethical and philosophical concepts to justify a live-stream genocide. I want to highlight 7 points, 1 minute each, about their findings. First, our experts made clear that the genocide we are witnessing is not a single event of a short period that started on October 7, but it's a century-long process which begins with dehumanization and ends with erasure and destruction of Palestinians. In between these two events, there are often concurrent a number of recognizable stages that include the test moment of violence, segregation, systemic weakening of the victim populations of Palestine, mass annihilation, denial and erasure that has been happening for more than 100 years. Thus, our experts note that the genocide is best understood, in addition to international law, through a state crime paradigm which centers on human rights violations committed in pursuit of state organizational goal and security. 2, our chamber members emphasize that the Israeli state was created as a settler colonial project imposed on the region by European imperial expansion to Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire after World War I, symbolized by British Empire's commitment to create an ethno-national state in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Our historians emphasize that this was an unexpected and undeserved imposition from outside. Cosmopolitan Palestinian populations composed of Muslims, Christians, and Jewish Arabs were equal citizens of the Ottoman state, with representatives in the Ottoman Parliament in Istanbul before World War I and British colonial rule. We repeat that there was no clash among different religious communities in Jews and Christians and Muslims before the British colonial rule and its imposition of Zionism to justify what happened afterwards. Our experts also emphasize that the Israeli settler colonialism of the last 100 years relies on an internal logic of genocide towards the indigenous native populations in Palestine, formulated by the biggest lie ever about the process, which is called, in a sentence, Palestine is a land without people promised to a people without land. That was never true. According to this logic, native Palestinian populations had to be expelled and erased as the only way to ensure the majority domination of Zionist settlers in the proposed state. This internal logic of genocide has continued and been normalized since the beginning of the British colonial rule over Palestine about a century ago. 3, our experts noted how Israel and its partners, Germany, France, England, and United States, attributed the cause and blame of genocide to the victims, the Palestinian victims, who are described simply without name as native people who had no right to self-defense, self-determination, and no right to resist colonial rule over their lands and their lives. Israeli regime presents its genocidal action as a necessity to create absolute security for the future of their state and justify mass murder and mass destruction in Gaza as a collateral damage. The right to self-defense of Israeli state became the most repeated legitimization of current genocide. Our genocide scholars in our group noted that almost all genocides were justified with that same logic. Genocides are not a big hate crime. Genocides always happen with the security logic. Our members shown that the complete destruction of homes, in that process, schools, universities, hospitals, infrastructure, and culture is important to the genocidal process to destroy the Palestinian identity. In addition to the destructive side of Israeli colonization, our members emphasize Israel's strategy of Judaization of Palestine through the discipline of archaeology to promote the erasure of the history of indigenous Arab natives who inhabited this land for thousands of years. 4, our experts noted the moral hypocrisy of the Israeli claim to build a homeland for victims of European anti-Semitism and Zionist settlers from Europe and America in Palestine by destroying the very homes of native Palestinians through the process of domicide. In addition to showing the link between the logics of homemaking for Zionist settlers and home destruction of native Palestinians, Chamber members examined the specific targeting of Palestinian universities, educational institutions, libraries, archives, in a process that is described as scholasticide, while Israeli universities have been receiving overwhelming support from Western governments. Some of the experts describe how the live streaming overkill of Palestinians in Gaza, it has relied on a global betrayal of the rules-based international order built after World War II, and the immoral backing of Israel's depiction of Palestinians as deserving to be erased as a threat to the security of Israel. 5, our experts critically examined the Israeli strategy of denial in occupied Palestine by juxtaposing or depicting the negative experience of destruction and erasure with the falsified lies and narratives of change, construction, and revival, best seen in the foundational myth that Israel has made an empty desert bloom with no acknowledgement of Palestinian agricultural life and prosperous Palestinian society before the colonial occupation. The slogan of Israel turning desert into bloom has been repeated by European Union chair and other politicians. Chamber members repeated that how Israel planted trees and tried to create forests sometimes over the very destroyed villages and towns from the ethnic cleansing war of 1948 Nakba as acts of Palestinian erasure. 6, our experts critically noted the significance of the weaponization of the theory of uniqueness of Holocaust by Israel and its backers to defend the genocidal destruction of Palestinian population. We found this to be extremely important. Claiming that the genocide of the European Jewish population by Nazi Germany is a singularly unique evil in world history. The Israeli regime and its supporters, such as German government, then argued that Israel could never be accused and guilty of similar crimes as the victims of that unique evil. Majority of the genocide scholars in the world today deny this uniqueness argument and approach genocide comparatively and establish links between Holocaust, the Nakba of Palestinians, and many other colonial genocides in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, Western Hemisphere. By positing the unique victimhood of European Jews in modern world history, Israeli regime and sponsors then asked the indigenous Arab populations of Palestine sometimes to give up their lives and homeland for those victims from Europe as an atonement, as a key term, for Europe's crimes and compensation, even though Palestinians had nothing to do with European anti-Semitism or Nazi Empire's crimes during World War II. By abusing this theory of the uniqueness of the Holocaust experience and identifying the Jewish religion with Israeli state and Zionism, Pro-Israeli governments, especially US government, silence and demonize any critic of Israel's genocide as anti-Semitic hate crime and try to ban it. Last point is about the language of civilization utilized to justify the genocide. Israel often calls its genocide as a battle of civilization against barbarism, a language we noted that it was commonly used during the era of European colonialism in Africa and the Latin America, Western hemispheres. We reject presenting the current genocidal assault in Gaza as a continuation of also a 1,000-year clash between members of Jewish and Muslim communities, or a clash between two civilizations. In fact, our reports show that the very clash of civilization theory is invented and developed by scholars to deny the justice claim and demands for equal rights by Palestinians in the 60s and 70s. To conclude, our chamber repeats that the never again should mean never again, regardless of who the victims are and who the perpetrators are, and we hope that our reports will be of use to the jury. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cengiz. Now I'm going to briefly step out of my moderator role and discuss a little bit about what happened in Sarajevo. But before discussing the consequences of Sarajevo and the declaration which arose from the contributions of all the chambers at that session, which is my main purpose, I want to briefly contextualize it. The world has arrived at a dangerous precipice. Palestine has exposed the fissures and the fractures that so glaringly divide our capitalist world. It has revealed in raw brutality the gaping chasm between persecutors and the persecuted, oppressors and the oppressed, colonizers and the colonized, the rich and the poor, the governors and the governed. And in so doing, Palestine has become the vanguard for the global anti-fascist, anti-colonial movement, for an awakening and recognition that change must come from below, must come from a newly animated civil society. The Gaza People's Tribunal encapsulates a key effort in this enterprise. My initial remarks relate to civil society, law, and challenging state crime through initiatives such as the Gaza People's Tribunal, BDS, the Global Sumud Flotilla, and the Sarajevo Declaration, which I'll discuss in a moment. Deploying law strategically, as the wonderful Hind Rajab Foundation do in their pursuit of holidaying Israeli genocidaire, and South Africa's brilliant case against Israel at the ICJ, can play a powerful role in the civil resistance against genocide. But imagining that the international legal order through the international courts can play anything more than a symbolic and normative role in the struggle is deeply misguided. With respect to Palestine, Israel has breached over 30 UN Security Council resolutions without consequence, and its daily egregious international crimes have led to nothing but impunity. Israel's ongoing genocide reflects the abject failure of the UN system thus far to prevent and punish war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Indeed, only a month ago, the US shamefully vetoed a call for a ceasefire for the 6th time at the UN Security Council. For me, as a scholar of state crime and genocide, the solutions to state criminality lie well outside the frameworks of criminal law, criminal justice, international conventions, and international courts. Instead, any such solutions are much more likely to be found in the struggles of the state's victims or with those who advocate and organize as allies of those victims. And it's the organization of those victims and allies that not only has the power to challenge state violence, but is central in defining that violence as criminal in the first instance. Civil society has proven itself to be a much more effective force than international law in identifying, gathering, and analysing and naming and challenging the devastating crimes of states. particularly through campaigns of civil disobedience, mass strikes, boycott, divestment and sanctions, and as with the global Samud flotilla, maritime attempts to break Israel's illegal blockade. Civil society enjoys widespread legitimacy as an authoritative check on the power and actions of the state. And because it operates from the ground up, it has far greater agility and capacity to recognize the processes involved in the earlier phases of state criminality. Why do we know about Israel's genocidal crimes? Not because the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry, which published its findings just a few weeks ago, a whole 2 years after the annihilation phase of the genocide began, nor because the Association of Genocide Scholars has finally found its conscience. Not because our legacy media reports on Israel's genocide and its decades-long persecution of Palestinians, nor because our governments denounce the genocidal state. To the contrary, our media and our governments have been central in sustaining and perpetuating these crimes. We know about Israel's crimes only because, for decades, Palestinian NGOs, critical researchers, Palestinian and other independent, courageous journalists and civil society groups have been documenting, evidencing, analysing and disseminating their findings in whichever ways they can. The Israeli crimes embodied in all the stages of genocide have thus been known for many years and include its decades-long policies and practices of settler colonialism, ethno-supremacism, apartheid, racial segregation, persecution, unlawful settlements, the denial of the right to return, collective punishment, mass detention, torture and cruel and inhuman treatment and punishment, extrajudicial executions, systematic sexual violence, demolitions, forced displacement and expulsions, ethnic purges and forced demographic change, as well as forced starvation, and the systematic denial of all economic and social rights. And now we're witnessing extermination. Civil society has been at the heart and centre of all evidence gathering in relation to all these crimes. And this work by civil society, not by the courts, not by the UN, not by the mass media, not by our governments, has led efforts to successfully name Israel's crimes as settler colonialism, apartheid and genocide. Unlike a court of law, the Gaza People's Tribunal begins from the premise that Israel is committing genocide, as Richard mentioned, that it is a settler colonial apartheid state underpinned by the racist ideology of Zionism. We don't require the hypothetical ruling of an international court, nor the dreadfully belated judgment of a UN independent commission to determine that a genocide is happening and has perhaps been happening incrementally since 1917. The evidence is manifold. Thousands of Palestinian and global civil society organisations, historians, state crime theorists, international relations scholars, philosophers and international lawyers all agree. We start from a recognition that governments and the international legal order have not simply failed the Palestinians, but they have actively enabled Israel's impunity and partnered its decades-long colonial persecution of the Palestinian people. For us, the challenge of justice and resistance falls to civil society, to acts of solidarity, to social movements, and to people of conscience everywhere. It understands the need to mobilize the power of the people in their millions to challenge the crimes of the Israeli regime and its co-conspirators, our own governments in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. The tribunal seeks to counter the forces of evil with the forces of justice by bringing pressure to bear in every sector and making clear that genocide will not be normalized, that apartheid will not be normalized, that colonialism will not be normalized, that Israel and its Zionist underpinnings will not be normalized, and in doing so, ensuring that fascism will not be normalized. We know that the Zionist regime is committed to seeing out its genocide, and we know that its principal genocidal partner, the United States government, is equally committed to this genocide. and to the erasure of Palestine. At the same time, we know that other Western governments, like the UK and Germany and complicit Arab states, have fully endorsed Israeli impunity and continue to do so. So the question is, how, in the face of such powerful forces of carnage, do we stop a genocide? How do we dismantle the Zionist state and those global powers whose ultimate goal is the erasure of Palestine, knowing that law and its international mechanisms are not the answer? The tribunal is clear. Genocide will only end through the steadfastness of the Palestinian people, coordinated resistance against Israel's genocide, the solidarity of the rest of the world, and the isolation, weakening, and dismantling of the Zionist regime and the global political and economic structures that support it. And so to the Sarajevo Declaration, which was the culmination of our work in Sarajevo. We laid out, as we've heard, the context for Israel's genocide in Sarajevo, and over the course of 4 days we listened to testimony on the history and ideological foundations of the genocide, on the crimes Israel and its partners have committed, and on the geopolitics fueling the genocide and its impunity. The Sarajevo Declaration was the culmination of the work of the tribunal to date, and it was both an unequivocal condemnation of Israel's genocide and a clarion cry to global civil society, an urgent call to action, and a commitment on the part of the Gaza People's Tribunal to work with partners across global civil society to bring an end to this genocide. So the declaration embodies a series of demands around which civil society is already organising, demands which speak directly to the myriad crimes we've heard about. The declaration thus demands, amongst other things, an immediate withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza and an end to the genocide, to all Israeli military action, an end to forced displacement and expulsions, an end to the settlement activities, an end to the siege of Gaza, and to restrictions of movement in the West Bank. It calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all prisoners, including the thousands of Palestinian women, men and children held most often without charge in abusive Israeli detention facilities. It insists on the immediate resumption of humanitarian aid to all of Gaza without restriction or interference, including food, water, shelter, medical supplies and equipment, sanitary equipment, rescue equipment and construction materials that are required for the rebuilding of Gaza. It also calls for a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanese and Syrian territory, and of course would have included a demand for the immediate cessation of Israel's bombings and targeted assassinations in Iran, Yemen, Qatar and Tunisia had they occurred before May 2025. The Sarajevo Declaration recognises the dangerous forces in both the state, corporate and supra-institutional spheres are pushing us towards the void, towards a future in which humanity itself is threatened. The events of the past 24-25 months and the Tribunal's own deliberations have convinced us both that key international organisations and most countries in the world, whether acting individually or collectively, have not only failed in defending the rights of the Palestinian people and responding to the Israeli regime's genocide in Palestine, but have to varying degrees been complicit or actual partners in these crimes. In the Declaration, we extend solidarity to global civil society, which has risen up against the genocide in extraordinarily brave and creative ways, but which has encountered McCarthyite suppression and increasing state violence. We denounce the wave of persecution against human rights defenders, peace activists, students, academics, workers, professionals, and we pay tribute to those who, despite this persecution, have had the courage and moral conviction to stand up and speak out, while rejecting the ridiculous Hasbara tactics of smearing as anti-Semitic or supporters of terrorism all those who dare publicly to challenge the Israeli regime and its European and US allies. Significantly, the Declaration rejects wholesale the destructive ideology of Zionism, the official state ideology of the Israeli regime. It's the forces of Zionism that colonized Palestine in 1948 and continue to colonize the occupied Palestinian territories, and it is Zionism with its inherent racism that created the Israeli apartheid state on the ruins of traditional Palestine. The belief in a Jewish supremacist state that drives pro-genocidal Israeli organizations and their surrogates on the far right today. The declaration demands immediate action to isolate, contain, and hold accountable the Israeli regime through universal boycott, divestment, sanctions, a military embargo, suspension from international organizations, and the prosecution of all its perpetrators. The final lines of the declaration are worth repeating. And I quote, "The challenge of justice now falls to people of conscience everywhere, to civil society and to social movements, to all of us. Palestinian lives are at stake. The international moral and legal order is at stake. We must not fail. We must not relent." And to conclude, millions of people continue to march in cities around the world. Civil resistance groups target Israeli-linked armaments factories. Trade unions have blocked weapons shipments to Israel. The BDS movement, particularly through academic and cultural boycotts, has grown in power, and a phenomenal 26,000 people signed up for the global Samud flotilla in an attempt to break the siege. The message of the Sarajevo Declaration is that in spite of, because of, the forces of darkness we find ourselves surrounded by, we must continue to do everything, everywhere, and at all times to stop Israel's attempts at Palestinian erasure, and at the same time to restore justice and humanity in a world hurtling towards fascism. In his closing address to the final session of the Vietnam War Crimes Tribunal, Bertrand Russell declared in words that equally impel our resistance today, and I quote, and I'll end on this quote, "The napalm and pellet bombs, the systematic destruction of a heroic people, are a barbarous rehearsal. The starving and the suffering will no longer die in silence. We must discredit the arrogant demand that they protect our comfort with their quiet agony."
Thank you, Professor Green. This would be the first session today, overview of the work of the Gaza Tribunal Chambers. Now we give you 15 minutes of coffee break, and then we head back to listening global statements of conscience and discuss.
Nice to meet you. Yes, Ani.
conscience who are in power with stockpiles of bombs at their disposal, and laughter used to describe the use of newer and specialty weapons asked for, given to, and used on the Palestinian people. In this vacuum of justice,
And the first is Raji Sarani. Mr. Sarani, do you hear me? Are you with us?
Yes, I do hear you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your time, and please, the time is yours.
Thank you. Dear Richard, dear jury's member, it's very special in me to address you and talking to you for people who are conscious about justice and dignity of man, who are looking for this unprecedented grave crimes committed against Palestinian people in the occupied Palestinian territories. I think what makes this tribunal unique and special, three issues. First, I think that for the first time and in unprecedented way, the world justice system, ICC and ICJ, subject to unprecedented attack by superpower like United States, and for the first time we are seeing, in Palestine case precisely, designation and sanction be imposed on prosecutors, judges, and lawyers and human rights organizations. This is unique and unprecedented. Why? That's because of Palestine. So the problem is not really with the world justice system. The problem is related to the political will of the world community. The second, I think what we are having right now, there is ongoing genocide. They spoke about peace, they spoke about ceasefire, but actually the genocide, the apartheid, the ethnic cleansing, with the conditions existing, makes definitely the crime going on. And the third point, it's related to the Convention of Prevention and Punishment of Genocide crime. The title of the agreement itself shows in a clear-cut way the most important part of it, the prevention, not to have it. And most of the states, when they signed, they said never again for this crime. So these three components, I think, makes much more important having this popular public tribunal for Palestine, for Gaza, and the fact that the genocide is still going on makes it unique and very special. We have serious problem related to the world legal system. We are aware and know that the ICJ issued 3 provisional measures decisions. And these 3 provisional measure decisions was simple, clear, and it was precisely allowing since January 2024 the humanitarian aid and the food supplies to go on to Gaza unconditionally. But actually since then, the famine is still going on, and this wasn't, implemented exactly like the 2 warrants issued against Netanyahu and Gallant from the ICC. After issuing it, some prime ministers in Europe and the President of the United States said these are irrelevant and Netanyahu Gallant can come and visit and should be no consequence on that. And he was received as first-class visitor to the White House. It's unprecedented that wanted to ICC and somebody who is suspected of doing war crimes, he is received full-fledged at the White House, not once, not twice, even 3 times after that. And that showed how the West dealing with the issues related to Palestine and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that make emphasis about the popular tribunal as such. I want to say for the first time ever, we have a clear-cut consensus among international human rights organizations, among the UN bodies, among the Palestinian human rights organizations and the Israeli human rights organizations about describing the situation and having the solid conclusions about what's going on, and describe in very detailed and precise words that what's going on, it's a genocide against the Palestinian people. So the problem, it's not at all related to how we describe really what's going on, what's the legal definition of what's going on, or what we are having as concrete evidence related to the situation in the Gaza Strip. Facts, standards, conclusions are simple, direct, and clear. The problem, it's with the political will. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict didn't begin October 7th. Long history before that. The short version, 58 years since the occupation began, and the long version since the Nakba in 1948. And the Israeli crimes evident and clear before October 7th. They are occupying power, and the occupation by itself a crime of aggression as it defined in the ICC Rome Statute. 2, we are having also the blockade on Gaza. We have the settlements policy in the West Bank. We have the ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem. We are having the pillage in the West Bank. We are having, beside the blockade, 5 wars launched against Gaza in the eye of the storm, were civilian and the civilian targets. So before the war, Israel was there in the ICC, and Palestine began to engage with the ICC since January 2015. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict is one of the most well-documented conflicts in the modern history. It's clear, simple, evident, and what's like there, not related to, again, facts or standards or the conclusions. It's related to the political will. Most recently, we have had something called Trump plan. Nobody wants peace, security, ceasefire more than the suppressed and the oppressed. Nobody need that more than the Gazans and Palestinians, those who are subject to massive destruction, massive displacement, massive killing, and famine. They want that badly. They seek to have it, but unfortunately, this came as just declaration of ceasefire. But how can we talk about peace while 90% of Gaza erased and destroyed, while almost 2 million displaced in Gaza, while still the famine all over the place, while there are lack of the basic, very fundamental issues like water, healthcare, hospitals, medicine, food, etc. So the current situation in Gaza, making genocide going on, making ethnic cleansing going on, without horizon, without agreement about ending the occupation, without agreement on having the Palestinians the right of self-determination, to achieve their unalienable rights of the Palestinian people, without having justice, dignity, and accountability for the criminals who committed these things. It's very hard to speak about peace. The word peace, yet, it's a word used as mirage. It's not reality on the ground. What is going on till this moment? Ongoing genocide, ongoing ethnic cleansing for the Palestinian people. Only, Palestinian people can enjoy the peace when they achieve, the right of self-determination and independence and ending the occupation. When they feel the genocider and those who practice the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing has been held accountable. I think with what's going on, it's very hard to see horizon for that. That's why it's very and vitally important to keep the popular tribunal on Gaza and to keep such work, because it's obvious yet the US and Western European countries at large is still in clear-cut support for the occupation, still recognize Israel's right of self-defense, and they are the victim, not the victimizers, and still, don't recognize the full political right of the Palestinian people of self-determination and independence and having justice and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sourani. And for those who were not able to be here physically or make a video, they did send us a message so that words can be heard. Arundhati Roy says, I'm sorry that I cannot be present at the final session of the Gaza Tribunal, so I thought I would at least send a brief message. Today is the 12th of October, and Israelis' live-streamed genocide of Palestinians is just over 2 years old. Despite being armed and supported by the richest countries in the world, it has not succeeded militarily in its stated aim of wiping out Hamas as retribution for its October 7th attack on Israel. Instead, it has killed almost 70,000 people who were part of the tiny, encircled, occupied, and isolated population of Gaza. The final death toll will only be known once the thousands of tons of rubble has been cleared. Days ago, a ceasefire was brokered by the government of the United States, which, according to its own State Department, has given $40 billion over the last 2 years to support Israel as it went about its hard task of murdering tens of thousands of civilians, mostly women and children, bombing 90% of Gaza's dwellings to rubble, destroying hospitals, and killing hundreds of journalists. Could Israel have done this without the support of the governments of the United States and Europe? Very unlikely. Certainly, the United States could have stopped the killing in an afternoon if it wanted to. So the question is, whose genocide is it, and who should be held accountable? It is hard to know at this point whether the ceasefire will hold or whether it is yet another deadly, cunning trick. For the sake of the people of Gaza, I fervently wish that it will hold, even if it is a ceasefire that is designed to disguise a real estate deal that will profit a group of war criminals. For now, the killing must stop. If it does, perhaps this tribunal could hold a special session right amidst the rubble of what Gaza once was, where Palestinians will describe what they have endured and share their dreams for their future. Perhaps only then will we have the full measure of the honor and the horror that unfolded while the murderers were applauded and urged on. But until then, the task of keeping track, naming names, collating evidence will be a work in progress. The perpetrators are not only those who pulled the triggers and dropped the bombs, not only those government officials who have driven Palestinians off their lands and to the brink of starvation and mass, not only those who have used food and aid as a ruse to murder more people, not only those who have tortured and sexually abused Palestinian prisoners, but also those governments and corporations who have supported all of this. Also those mainstream newspaper and TV channels that have willfully lied and spread fake news. Also those editors, columnists, and journalists who developed a sophisticated slanted language that dehumanized Palestinians and prepared the grounds for genocide with impunity. All these people and organizations will, I'm sure, one day be named and indicted. The task of defining who is the perpetrator and then bringing them to account is an onerous one. We need a genocide audit. I'm sure the Gaza Tribunal is fully cognizant of all of this, which is why your work is both urgent and necessary. So that was Arundhati Roy. And now we will see a video message of Marsha Cross.
For the past 2 years, we've been witnessing a genocide, the deliberate destruction of a people and their land in full view of the world. Every day has brought new evidence, entire families wiped out, people buried under rubble, children shot by snipers or blown to bits, their parents forced to pick up remains of their tiny bodies and put them into plastic bags. Neighborhoods have been flattened. In fact, 85% of all of Gaza has been decimated. Hospitals and their heroic doctors obliterated or taken hostage, and the list goes on and on. With the international community unable or unwilling to stop it, the legal and political systems designed to protect life have failed. International law, the very architecture meant to safeguard our common humanity, has been paralyzed by politics, by double standards, and by men who lack any conscience, who are in power with stockpiles of bombs at their disposal. And laughter, used to describe the use of newer and specialty weapons, asked for, given to, and used on the Palestinian people. In this vacuum of justice, the Gaza Tribunal was born, a moral court created by civil society to document the truth, to preserve evidence, to hold power accountable when official institutions refuse to do so or are unable to do so. My own awareness of the situation in Gaza happened in the summer of 2014. My daughters were 7 years old and we were on a family road trip through the national parks. I would lie in the back seat of our SUV to avoid being car sick and scroll through my phone to pass the time between our stops. And randomly, I came across a post about Gaza. And until then, I knew almost nothing about Palestine and Israel. I just thought it was a place that was far away, and I was told it was beautiful and that I should visit it. I thought maybe I would one day. But then I started reading and I couldn't look away. The number of Palestinians being killed was absolutely horrifying. There seemed to be no number that would satisfy the Israeli government in their retaliation. And I later realized that this was one of many, many battles, if you want to call them that. This one was called Operation Protective Edge. And I thought I needed to know more, so I began listening to Israeli soldiers from breaking the silence, speaking about the occupation and about checkpoints and about raids that terrorized citizens, waking them up in the middle of the night, taking over their homes. And I watched documentaries, and I saw with utter horror what was happening in this conflict that we were told was too complicated to understand. And I was horrified, but shamefully I went back to my life, raising children, caring for my family, and I looked away. And then came October 7th, and of course at first I reacted with horror at the attack, but I wasn't surprised. And soon the retaliation unfolded and the threats to annihilate Gaza were openly declared, and I watched with terror, because I knew from what I had learned in the past that the reaction by Israel would be bad. And when the civilian death toll in Gaza doubled the Israeli losses on October 7th, well, I thought, well, this must be enough. I mean, surely this is going to stop. But it didn't stop. I kept going, and I was riddled with grief and panic, because I thought, who am I? Who am I if I stay silent? And who, of course, who would I have been at another time, in another place, when others were being annihilated and good people said nothing? I couldn't function. I couldn't live with myself. This was 2 weeks in. I had no idea it was going to last for 2 more years, maybe longer, God forbid. And so I wrote on my social feeds, ceasefire. And for that, like hundreds of others to come, I was accused of hate. Friends I'd known for decades suddenly saw me not as a fellow mother, not as a woman begging for the killing to stop, but as someone they believed hated Jews. I was shocked. I mean, how could this happen? I mean, what kind of conditioning leads someone to erase decades of friendship, knowing me, in just a moment? To believe that empathy for one people must mean hatred of another, or that it even had anything to do with their religion. I didn't care. I was dumbfounded. And then, after sitting with that pain, I understood something much deeper. That those reactions, they weren't spontaneous. They were the product of years and years of indoctrination, the belief planted young that everyone was out to get them, that criticism of a state is hatred of a people, and that those who demand justice or liberation are enemies. And even more to the point, that those others, those Palestinians, were animals, monsters, unworthy of empathy. And this is the soil in which dehumanization grows, the mental and moral ground that allows atrocities to continue unchecked. And that's why I'm here. Because my conscience, our conscience, cannot stop at sympathy. It has to move toward action. And the Gaza Tribunal is that action. It is the organized conscience of civil society, documenting, archiving, and exposing the crimes committed against the people of Gaza, including those that meet the legal definition of genocide. It exists because official systems have failed. It exists because silence, no, it's not an option. And it exists because truth, it must be recorded for the victims, so many victims, for history, and for the future. I'm inviting you to join this journey of conscience, to listen, to bear witness, to help amplify the truth. Please come to the final session of the Gaza Tribunal. It's taking place in Istanbul on October 23rd to the 26th, or you can follow online and stand with those who refuse to look away. Because as we see, justice is not inevitable. It must be willed into being through courage, through witness, through action, to help amplify the truth.
Thank you to March Across, and now we will hear a message from Omar Soleimani.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. First and foremost, I want to thank Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. First and foremost, I want to thank you all for the incredible work that's been done with this tribunal to establish the facts that have been so obvious to anyone that's been paying attention, even with the bare naked eye, that this genocide has been the most horrific of our lifetimes, and it's one that must be sufficiently recorded, and it's one that must be sufficiently stopped, met with action. And you cannot record enough of the facts on the ground in every single dimension of this genocide's undertaking, whether it be in the destruction of the healthcare system, whether it be in the destruction of the ecology of Gaza. All of it comes together and is absolutely important for us, critical for us, to record each and every single part of it, because the story of the Palestinian people has been a story of redemption, a story of renewal after the Nakba, after removal. And for over 7 decades, the people of Palestine have insisted that whether they live physically in their land of Palestine or whether they remain only as emotional and spiritual dwellers in their historic homeland, that they will not allow for anything that has been a part of them to be forgotten, and that they intend to renew and to restore and to maintain the legacies that have been passed down to us throughout generation. I want to share one thing which I think is extremely important for us as we are undertaking this exercise, that you can never assume that history is going to be recorded properly in the moment. You know, many times we think that because things are so obvious, we don't have to worry about losing them in that moment. But if we don't record the story now, then our children won't know how to tell it. So it's important to establish the facts on the ground now so that we can have immediate and urgent action. The Palestinian people have suffered for long enough. The people of Gaza have suffered for long enough. But it's important that the story is also preserved and told for generations to come, because it may be that there's another generation that will certainly need to build upon the restoration. That's assuming the best case scenario of what we are able to achieve together. And I have no doubt that with inspired action, with experts, with academics, with activists, with people of conscience and people of faith, that we will be able to achieve in our lifetime some of the most remarkable things that are necessary to reverse the course that the Palestinian people have been put on, unfortunately, through these acts of destruction and before genocide of apartheid. So thank you all very much for being a part of this tribunal, and I pray that the facts that have been established are the foundation for a better future for the Palestinian people and for people around the world that are suffering under the boots of oppression and colonization. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you all.
And after Omar Soleimani, we will hear Roger Waters. He's also on the video.
My name is Roger Waters. We're all in Istanbul. I know you know that. Actually, I'm not in Istanbul. I did this last Monday. All right. Here we go. It is time to call a spade a spade. No more pussyfooting. Zionism is a failed ideology. A majority of ordinary people all over the world know that to be true. A majority of Jewish people all over the world know that to be true. Israel is a failed state. Any state that admits it has to commit genocide to survive has already failed. Ordinary people all over the world know this to be true. So, what to do? The so-called Trump peace plan is a bad joke. It openly and unashamedly denies the Palestinian people basic human rights. So what do you suggest, Roger? What's your peace plan? Well, sumud, steadfast perseverance in resistance to the occupation. We must keep on taking to the streets in our millions. We must keep on raising our voices. The sound of our choir needs to be so loud it pierces the palace walls. No king should be allowed to sit smiling on a throne soaked in the blood of our children. Yes, I'm talking about you, Mohammed bin Salman. I'm talking about you, Sisi, in Egypt. I'm talking about the Qatari and Jordanian royal families. I'm talking about the rulers of the Arab Emirates. I'm talking about everyone except our noble brothers and sisters, the Houthis in Yemen. Our final goal must be to turn back the clock 100 years to before the stain of Zionism blackened the land. We work towards a free, democratic Palestine from Lebanon in the north to Egypt in the south and from the River Jordan to the sea. And what becomes of Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and Trump and Starmer and Witkoff and Hegseth and Rubio and the rest of them? Well, that's for history to decide. Obviously, they deserve equal human rights, just like the rest of us. But their fate will lie in the hands of international law. We shall see. But that is the future. Will it ever be achieved? I hope so. Unfortunately, I don't have my crystal ball here with me today. What I do know is it won't happen overnight. We need to be realistic. We need a realistic first step. And that is why I am here today. Donald, pay attention. This is important. The realistic first step to which I refer is uniting for peace. I call upon all world leaders, but especially all the Arab leaders, to, for once, represent the will of your peoples and stand solidly behind Gustavo Petro and the people of Colombia in their call for a vote in an emergency session of the General Assembly. A vote to authorize the sending of a multinational United Nations peacekeeping force into Gaza and all the other occupied Palestinian territories to stop the Israeli genocide, to restore UNRWA in its great work of provision and aid to those beleaguered people, and to remove the illegal Israeli army of occupation. That is the first step we need. And Gustavo, my good friend, we, the people of the world, need that draft resolution on our desks first thing tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Waters and our dear guests, academics, professors, and everyone involved in today's session. I'm calling you for a lunch break, and the lunch will take place here at the university. And please ask our young volunteers who have these Gaza t-shirts to track you and show you where you will have your lunch. So yes, thank you, and I will see you at 2. Yes, Penny has a point, sorry.
Just to say, could you please be here about 5 to 2, because it always takes some time to get in and settled. And we caught up, which was marvellous this morning in terms of time, and we want to do the same this afternoon. So thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.